So many of you know that my last assignment was in Oshawa. So it's kind of unique. It was my first time as a pastor, but I had a dual assignment. So that was really kind of fresh. I was there for 6 years. So pastor at St. Joseph the Worker in Oshawa, as well as priest chaplain of Ontario Tech, Durham College in Trent. And whenever you have a new transition in terms of a new vocation or a new stage in life, quite apart from like the particular tasks that you do, there's also the kind of the stress of just assuming a new identity. You know, I remember in terms of my own formation, one of the most stressful periods was just being a seminarian. And not like I had any responsibilities, but I was just like, I remember all my energy was just wasting away simply because I was being used to being a seminarian in a parish, you know, during my internship year. And so imagine if that's the case for internship, how much more so when, you know, a new pastor, as well as, you know, being a chaplain, all these different things. And I remember it got to the point where I was feeling kind of burnt out. And so I thought, gosh, I could do something like kind of drastic here. So I decided to go on a personal retreat. And so basically, the Sarah Club here in the Archdiocese of Toronto, they have this really sweet deal where they have a couple rooms in the seminary in Florida where you can basically rent out these rooms on the cheap. If you're a priest from the Archdiocese of Toronto, I think it's like $50 a night, and you can stay there. So it's like, Florida, yes, right? So I went there for a week, and I'd never done a personal retreat before. In the back of my mind, I thought, oh, personal retreats are for the week. And so I remember going there and trying desperately to figure out how to relax. And the thing which really worked, sounds weird, the thing that really worked was just being by the water with my little Bible. And I had the page turned to what is actually my favorite passage in the entire Bible, which says Gospel of Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's typical of graces from the Lord. You know, it's like, here's a gift, freely given, freely received, but there's something you need to do to unwrap the gifts or to unlock the door, right? So what's implied in that is that here's the offer of Christ's peace, but there's something you need to do, again, to unwrap the gift and unlock the door. So those things are, take on the Lord's yoke, right? Learn to imitate his humility, and enter into his meekness, right? So the yoke thing, the humility thing, just to kind of be economical here, basically the idea is that don't live in your mind, be fully present to life, so humility of the earth, right? And take on the Lord's yoke as opposed to competing yokes, right? Only the Lord's yoke is easy, only his burden is light. But more to the point, this idea of meekness, right? So yesterday we dealt with the first two Beatitudes, but today, the third Beatitude, this idea of meekness. Blessed are those who are meek, for they shall inherit the earth. How fortunate those who are meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And the reason why I told that whole story about, you know, being burnt out and whatever, and just taking in this passage, is to give you a sense of context, right? So we talked last night about how all the Beatitudes are conducive towards participating in divine life in its fullness, right? And once you understand that, you realize, okay, like that's the context with which I'm supposed to read this particular Beatitude, as of all the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the meek. So obviously it begs the question, what does it mean to be meek? What does it mean to be meek? Often misunderstood, right? So often we think of meekness in terms of being shy, being socially awkward, right? That sort of thing, right? So social dexterity, right? But meekness is not really about that, right? So meekness is basically about focus and discipline, and everything is situated in terms of God's particular call for my life. Now, it's one of those things, it's like, okay, what does that look like in practice, right? In theory, it's always scary to think about following the Lord in earnest. Whenever you think about following the Lord in earnest, it always seems kind of scary. Like, so I give him everything and hold back nothing. Nothing is out of place. Everything I do, even the slightest expenditure of time and attention and energy, it's meant to be situated in terms of God's particular call for my life. And again, more to the point, the idea is that when you think about that in theory, it seems kind of scary. I may have mentioned this joke to you before, but I remember walking in downtown Toronto. I was passing by this store. It was just kind of selling random things, and there was this T-shirt, and it said, "God is watching. Keep busy," right? And sometimes we do that, right? Like I don't feel comfortable praying into the thing. Okay, Lord, what do you want me to do in terms of, you know, my life, my day, the duty of the moment? And so by default, it seems like, okay, the safe thing to do is to keep frantically busy, to stay frantically stressed, and to stay frantically worried, right? But you think about it for a second, like, well, no, is that the life that the Lord wants you to live? And you realize in retrospect, well, no, he actually gives me a yoke which is easy, and his burden alone is light, right? It's a good kind of rule of thumb to realize that the life that the Lord wants me to lead is meant to have a certain natural rhythm and balance, sort of befitting the Sabbath day, right? So, yeah, there are times I'm called to work, but there's also times where I'm called and commanded to rest and to play and to pray and all those different things. And when we have kind of a loose sense of boundaries with regards to that, then that's when we become kind of scattered and worried and afraid, right? So that's where meekness really comes in. So purpose and direction and focus, everything situated in terms of God's particular will for my life, right? It's not to say that God won't pull you necessarily at times out of your sense of routine. So you gotta be careful about that, right? So shades of what we talked about yesterday. So you don't want your life to become a concentration camp. But at the same time, it's symptomatic of the Catholic both and, right? So my life should have structure and balance and rhythm, but at the same time, I'm not holding on to my structure and all those things so tightly that there's no room to breathe, right? And so one way it's phrased by one particular spiritual writer is like, look, you have your routine, but hold life lightly in your hands. Or another way to put it is like, okay, if something comes across your path, and the particular demand of love requires you to break from your patterns and routines and habits, well, then do that, right? Otherwise, you fall into the routine and the mentality of the scribes and the Pharisees. Here's our routine. Here's the way we're supposed to live our lives. And maybe it begins from a place of good intention, but then if it doesn't conduce to the freedom befitting the children of God, or prevents me from loving from that space, then clearly something is wrong, right? So I remember my spiritual director talking about this, right? He talked about it in terms of a spectrum. And on one side, there's like the law, let's say. On the other side, there's like the spirit. So the law and the spirit. Both are good. Neither is bad, right? But the idea is that, let's say, the law represents discipline and structure and routine, and the spirit's kind of the opposite. Relax, let this go, whatever, right? Again, both are good. And what do you need? You need both. Now, what's interesting, and this is why it's a really helpful working image, right? As you progress in life, where you are in the spectrum is different. So what is often typical is, people pre-conversion, they're all over the place, right? And so I don't know the Lord, I'm not trying to follow my religion and faith in a really systematic sort of way. And so, I don't know, I'm just like all over the place in terms of how I live my life. My heart is scattered, my life is scattered. So what do I need more of? I need more of the law. I need structure, I need routine. I need to remember to go to Mass on Sundays. I need to practice my faith. I need to say my prayers. I need to have a schedule. I need to work. I need to study, depending on what your state in life is, right? But then typically what happens is, okay, you're developing a certain structure. Maybe you're living according to that structure, which is good, and it's going on for a certain period of time. But then you discern, actually the Lord wants me to kind of pull back in a certain sense, Maybe I have too much of the law in my life. I need more of the Spirit. And maybe you're going about your life and you have too much of the Spirit, right? So, gosh, I need more of the law, right? But again, flexibility. Like, what do I need in this particular state in life, right? In this particular mode of my spiritual journey. That's why it's problematic to label yourself. Others, certainly, that's bad too. But to label yourself, like, who am I? I'm an organized person, right? Or I'm a free spirit, right? And it's like, well, you can see why people do that, but in a certain sense, entirely not helpful. Like, if you need more of the Spirit, do that. If you need more of the law, do that, right? But labels and saying that I am locked in this thing forevermore, it almost is resistant to the grace of conversion. Wherever you need, just do that. Receive that particular grace, right? So anyways, with regards to meekness, I always think about this image from Father John Riccardo. He talked about horses, So you think about a horse. You buy a wild horse, a wild stallion. If that horse is not meeked, what happens? Horse is all over the place, kicking up dust, kicking you in the face, all the different things. So like not meeked. But after the horse is meeked and disciplined and focused and trained, what is that horse like? The horse is not neutered, right? So the horse retains all his strength, all his energy, all his passion, but now everything is focused. Everything is disciplines, right? Everything is directed to particular purposes. And now the horse is useful. Now the horse is useful. Think about another analogy. Think about a lot of great saints from ancient times. So St. Peter, St. Augustine, St. Paul. Pre-conversion, right? Peter cutting off that servant's ear, all for the glory of God, right? Or St. Paul, out of zeal for God, I kill Christians, not realizing that I'm persecuting Christ, right? Or St. Augustine, fornicating, right? So a lot of passion, a lot of energy, like pre-conversion. Post-conversion, what happens though? Again, all their strength, all their energy, all their passion, but everything is directed to God's particular will for their lives. And that's the sweet spot. It plays on what we talked about yesterday, right? What's the goal with regards to emotions, right? It's not to kill the hearts. You're not meant to squash the emotions. These are meant to be great gifts. So when I have the capacity for passion and sadness and anger and great joy and enthusiasm, I'm called to recognize that this is a great gift. And how is God calling me to direct these particular things? I'll give you kind of a more focused example, which is relevant to everyone. Anger. So a couple things. Piggybacking off what we talked about yesterday, right? So your emotions, again, have no moral content. They're neither good nor bad. They simply describe how you feel. I feel angry, I feel sad. Doesn't mean you're bad. In the same way that when I feel happy, it doesn't mean I'm good. It's just how I feel. What matters, of course, is what do I do with that feeling? And again, one option you must not do is simply try to kill the hearts. Kill the horses that are pulling the chariot, right? So I remember at St. Augustine Seminary, I took this pastoral counseling class. And one of the things they said was that don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if you're in a pastoral situation, say, for example, in an office, talking to someone, and you are feeling inappropriate feelings or thinking inappropriate thoughts, right? So you're talking to someone, they're opening up their heart in terms of this is what's going on in my life. And you're like, gosh, I'm trying to concentrate, I'm trying to care, but I am bored out of my mind. Now, to qualify that, if it happens all the time, probably means you're heartless. But another thing that happens sometimes is you're with someone, and you're like, wow, this person is wildly attractive, right? Not to me. I've heard this happen sometimes, right? And so you're talking to someone, and it's this seems kind of inappropriate because I'm a celibate priest, and yet I feel this thing. But here's the point, right? When you're in a situation, what you feel is what you feel. What you feel is what you feel. And the worst thing you could do is be in a situation where gosh, I feel tired. I feel bored. I feel wildly attracted to this person. Oh, but I don't. I don't. And I shouldn't feel like that. And all of a sudden you're nervous and scared. What you're supposed to do is okay, I feel this thing very intensely, noted. I acknowledge my feelings. But then, because I have dignity as a child of God, I have the capacity to choose. John Paul II talks about this, right? And so he says, even though it's true that there are all sorts of secondary factors which can influence our ability to choose in the particular moments, habits and routine and fear and our emotions, whatever, the starting point is that you are a child of God. And because of that, you have dignity. And because of that, I have the power to choose. I might be an earthquake in my heart. I may have all sorts of impinging circumstances in terms of my life and whatever, but I can still choose. I can still choose to do what is right. I can still choose to do what I must, right? That's why it's interesting, a little bit of a side note, sometimes people will come into confession and they'll lead by kind of saying, well, Father, here's this pattern of sin that I have, but it's a deeply ingrained habit. And maybe they're just trying to fill in the blanks to help me have some context, to give them proper advice. But I want to make sure that they're not saying well, this is a deeply ingrained habit. This is something I've struggled with for years, and so therefore it's impossible for me to change. So what I'm looking for you is to say that it's okay, don't worry about it, right? I get it that it's a struggle. Fear is real. Habit is real. Deeply ingrained patterns of sin, that's a real thing. That's the human condition, right? But you got to remember, no, I have the power to choose in any given moment. Otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, the Lord is kind of dangling the carrot of potential conversion, but it's not possible. That's just mean, I think about, a movie example was coming, right? Minority Report, ever seen that? Tom Cruise? Okay. So basically it's this whole idea of there's these precogs. They're they can tell the future in terms of who's going to commit murder. And Tom Cruise plays this cop. And so he and others, they get advice or counsel from the precogs, and then they stop the murder from happening before it happens, right? But then the whole plot is like, all of a sudden the Tom Cruise character is accused of a murder that he's about to commit, but he's like, I don't even know that guy. And so the plot ensues, right? But one of the best scenes, right? So basically he has this watch where it's like, it's counting down in terms of like, they got it right down to the exact second when he's gonna kill this guy, right? And there's these kind of made up circumstances, and all of a sudden he sees this guy, he's fooled into thinking that this is the man who abused and killed my son. And he's like, no, I am going to kill this guy. And he's pointing the gun at him, right? Really powerful scene, right? But basically what's happening is like the clock is going down, like by the second, like 10, 9, 8, whatever. And he's looking, and he just wants to shoot this guy. And then all of a sudden it hits 0. It hits 0. And he's like, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. And you could tell, you could see the pain and the anguish in his face. This is really hard for me to do, right? And leading up to that, he's with a precog, and the precog's like, you can choose. You can still choose. Like, I know it's hard, I know it's painful, but you can do it because you have dignity, right? And that it's all conveyed in that particular scene. I just love it, right? But that's the human drama, right? And when we kind of give into a certain despair and we forget about that, our ability to rise over the challenges and to do what we can and do what we must, it's forgetting that, we're made in the image and likeness of God, right? Okay. Now, with regards to that, okay, so we're talking about anger. So anger is, Thomas Aquinas talks about this, right? So anger can be good or anger can be bad. So basically the idea is that anger can obviously be bad if it leads to, the way he phrases it, an irrational desire for vengeance. So I feel anger has no moral content, it's not good or bad, but if it leads me to want to destroy my neighbor, not good, right? An egregious violation of love. On the other hand, this is interesting, on the other hand, he says anger can be good. Anger can be good. It has the potential to be good, or it has the potential to lead to the good, in a sense that, okay, maybe I have what's called a righteous anger where something is wrong, I perceive something is wrong, and I have this thirst for justice, say, right? And so anger is sort of like an honest friend telling me, look, something seems wrong. Something incorrect is happening with regards to yourself, your loved one, or like in the world, right? Now, a couple of things with that, right? When it comes to anger, a lot of times, common mistakes, people tend to just like suppress their anger. And this kind of overlooks the fact that anger can be that honest friend, right? So what people will do is like, you can see why people do this. I don't want to sound overly judgmental here, right? People will feel guilty for even feeling angry. And that comes from a whole variety of different places, right? Maybe your parents or whatever, right? So, and oftentimes what you'll see is like people, they actually are angry, but they're like, no, I'm not angry. I'm not angry. It's like, yeah, just keep on saying it. I'm convinced, right? And then if it's not addressed in a healthy sort of way, we all know what happens there, right? Bad things. So it's got to go somewhere, right? So people feel this guilt, and then it leads to a certain kind of unhealthy suppression, right? So the idea is I need to, again, acknowledge what I'm feeling, be it sadness or frustration or whatever the case may be, and then figure out what does the Lord want me to do with this particular feeling, right? Now, something that can also be problematic is, this happens a lot, people presume that their anger is righteous. So even if they don't know about the whole like good-bad thing dichotomy with regards to Thomas Aquinas, it's like, I feel angry, I'm not a bad person, I'm a good person. And automatically my anger is a righteous anger. And so I must act on it because I'm a defender of justice. And it's like, that betrays a lack of self-knowledge, This is a way to kind of make it real for you, to convince yourself. There are a lot of terrible things happening in the world. And so, for example, starving kids in Africa. But no one is upset by that. I'm not angry by that, But if someone cuts me off, right, it's like, I'm livid. It's like, that's really disproportionate, So a lot of times what happens is like, okay, I'm angry because my ego is frustrated. Because I have a certain expectation for how this day is going to go, how my life is going to go, what I want, what I desire, and I'm not getting it. Maybe I'll even get it in the future, but I'm not getting it in the package that I want or in the timing that I want. So I'm mad. And I call it righteous anger. Whereas in reality, it's like, yeah, maybe you're just being a big baby. because things aren't playing out the way you want, right? And then what happens? I believe my anger is righteous, and I act from that place. I remember multiple times, talking to parishioners, not here, because everyone's lovely, right? But in previous placements, where people were like, Father, I'm like really angry, and therefore, right? And behind that is like, I'm feeling angry, I can't deny my anger, right? My anger must be righteous. And so therefore, you should do what I propose based on my feeling of anger. How crazy is that? I almost want to say, I never do, but this is in my priestly fantasy. I'm like, I would love to say, you know what, I'm actually more angry than you. So I think we should do this. And it's like, that's crazy. It's like, yeah, exactly. Right? Like, we often do that, though. We make decisions based on emotions, right? So I feel angry, my anger must be righteous, therefore I must act on my so-called righteous anger. Joe Heschmeyer, he's a recurring speaker. I think I mentioned him last night. He's a recurring speaker for Catholic Answers Focus. It was either him or Trent Horn. But they were talking about abortion, right? And so like one common argument in favor of abortion, you probably heard this, people will say like, oh, come on, don't you care about the poor? If you cared about the poor, you would advocate abortion. And it's like, how does that follow, right? Is it possible that I could be for the poor, but also against killing babies, right? But this idea is like, well, no, like this is my proposed solution to this complex political problem. And either you agree with me or I'm mad and I'm angry. And it's like, can't we just talk? Can't we just talk? So it's really important for us to know. I've obviously tried to revisit this in different ways during the time that I've been here, but it's really important for us to grasp this point, you know? The truth remains the truth whether or not we yell, right? And so I remember, it's a silly example, but hopefully it drives the point home. I remember back in the day when I was in grade school, I wanted to really make my point heard or felt. And so I would write these papers and would underline all these words, and every sentence would end with an exclamation mark. And someone once said, you know, you don't have to do that, right? Or if you feel you have to do that, maybe your prose is a little bit off, right? Because if you're phrasing it a certain way, you shouldn't need to underline everything and put exclamation marks. And it's a really good test for us, right? So in the same way that I don't yell when I say 1 + 1 is 2, it's like, oh my gosh, right? It's like what do I believe in my capacity to discover the truth through the use of right reason and authentic dialogue? And if I believe in that, I shouldn't have to yell and scream. We should be able to have a conversation, right? And here's the thing, too. Here's a real sweet spot. You should be able to have a conversation with someone where maybe you're diametrically opposed in terms of our respective stances with regards to this particular issue, but we can still have a calm conversation. And here's the other thing, just on top of that, right? You should be able to say to the other person who perhaps disagrees with you vehemently, like, look, my understanding is that your position is this for these reasons. Is that accurate? And they should be able to say, yeah. And you should be able to say in response, like, am I missing anything? And they should be able to say in response, well, no, that entirely represents my position, even though we might still disagree. If you can't get to that point, then someone's not really listening, someone's not really communicating. Maybe it's actually both of you, right? So just to be aware of that. Now, in terms of ways to move forward, right? So again, going back to this notion of anger, right? I find what really helps actually is just building in time and space. So the analogy that comes to mind, it's like an airbag. You know, so when you're in a car accident and your car has an airbag, what the airbag does, it doesn't stop the impact, but it just builds in more time before your chest hits the steering wheel, or whatever the case may be. So similar thing with this, right? No matter who you are, whether you're having an inflammatory personality or not, when you're angry or you're upset, it's tough to think clearly, right? And so it's really important to be disciplined in terms of building in time and space from the immediate experience of this intense emotion and my decision points. A lot of times we're like, I have to make the decision right now, otherwise what? You actually don't. A lot of times you actually don't. You can actually purposely and intentionally build in time and space to see the thing clearly. I may have told you this example before, but I remember talking to Cardinal Collins once, and he phrased it in a really interesting sort of way. Basically, just a paraphrase. He's like, a lot of things come across my desk, as you might imagine, as the Archbishop of Toronto and the Cardinal and whatever. And if I'm not careful, I can easily slip into this thing where this thing which is across my desk right now is similar to something which happened to me before in the past. And they're similar, and therefore they're the same, and so I should treat those situations exactly the same way. And so basically, again, just to paraphrase what he said is, I have to rein myself in. So maybe I do that for the sake of like efficiency or whatever, but it's important that I make the right decision. So here's this thing, and like this seems to remind me of this. But maybe that's not accurate. And so I build in again time and space and just let the truth kind of emerge. To let the truth emerge. And the truth does that. You know, if we have the capacity to have the time and space and to discover the truth reveals itself when it's darn well ready. Right? Something else that could be really helpful is to, again, just to piggyback off that comment, to have this mentality where I want to discover the truth. So Lord, like, what do you want me to do in terms of the situation? And even before that, what do you see about this particular situation? Again, it's a variation of like, I presume that my anger is righteous. We often presume, especially in the heat of the moment, that I have a complete and accurate understanding of all the relevant factors. But you don't. And what reveals that to be the case is time and space, Especially if you pray into it. Like, Lord, what am I missing? And I want to see it. What am I missing? How do you see the situation? How do you see this person? And more importantly, like, what are you calling me to do to help move the situation along, right? Because again, going back to that whole thing of like, righteous anger versus like the violation of my ego. Again, this is like self-awareness. A lot of times what happens is we're going through life and I'm angry because my ego is frustrated and I lash out in this, thoughtless, irrational sort of way. Not because I'm really seeking God's will, not because I've even asked that question, but because I just want to relieve the tension. And if you think about it, it's kind of selfish, actually. It has nothing to do with God's call. I'll give you an example. I remember one time I was in a situation where I needed to offer fraternal correction, let me put it that way. And I was impatient. And so here's a situation, it's like, this is not right. This thing needs to be said. And it wasn't right. And something needed to be said. But looking back on it, it wasn't supposed to be me. And also the timing was off. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, and she's like, look, if you do this, you can do it if you want, but just know that you're doing it for you, you're not doing it for this person. You're doing it just so you can feel better, as opposed to helping this person along the path of grace or doing God's will, right? But I went ahead and did it anyways, and it blew up in my face. So don't do that. It's bad, right? So it's the whole thing. It's a variation of like what makes a thing good. It's everything, right? The choice that I make, timing issues, delivery, all these different things, right? I'll give you another example as sort of a counterpoint. So I remember one time there was a situation. I'm trying to like tell the story to protect the innocent, but it's so hard. But basically, it was a situation where someone did something wrong. Someone did something wrong in a public sort of way, and it was pretty clear that it was wrong. And what happened is the person knew it was wrong, and the person knew that I knew that this person did this thing and was aware of the whole thing. And so at the end, the person came up to me and didn't say anything. Just came up and was in my presence. And full expecting I was going to say like, you should have done this thing, and da-da-da. But I knew that he knew that I knew what he did was wrong. I also knew that he knew what to do going forward in the future. So what's there to talk about? So what happened is he came by, and I was just like, hey, how's it going? Yeah, have a good night. Like, what further point was to kind of expound on a thing, to like, show him a boss or shame him or whatever. Like, if the whole goal is to like, recognize the wrong and try to make amends going forward, like, I knew that he knew it, and he knew it, right? So what's there to talk about? So it's a variation of like, only as much as the Lord wants me to say this or do that, again, timing, circumstance, whatever, you gotta be super attentive, because that's the thing that bears fruit. It's a variation of, blessed are those who are meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Okay. Now, the next beatitude here is number 4, right? So, how fortunate those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. So, this is another one of those translation things, right? So the Greek and the Hebrew. So in the Greek, it's like, what is justice? Justice is right relationship. Right relationship. And it's not just me. It's not simply a private thing. It's not simply me and my relationship with God. It's like right relationship between God and the world, right relationship between me and other people, and whatever, right? So it's a public thing, as is typical of the spiritual life, right? Now, in the Hebrew, it's translated as holy, which is kind of interesting. So what does it mean to be a holy person? Various habits of self-control, certain virtues, a mystical aura. Now, the holy person is the just person. The holy person is the just person. So what I hunger and thirst for, righteousness, right relationship with God in every circumstance of life. That's what holiness is. And just to kind of think about how much that kind of upsets our conventional notion of what holiness is all about, right? Now, again, to go to this notion of hungering and thirsting for it. So even in that, you see this, shades of like the importance of passion. And the idea here is to not settle, but at the same time to use the appropriate means to bring about justice. So obviously here we're at St. James Parish in Colgan. So I'm going to use I don't typically do this, but I'm going to use a particular example from a person, right? So for those watching in cyberspace, there was a longtime parishioner we had here who was a really good friend of mine when I first arrived at the parish, and she's since passed away. Her name is Louise Lowndes, right? And really good friend. I can't say enough in terms of what she did for me when I first arrived, when I didn't know anyone, and just like the immensity of the thing, And I had the privilege of doing her funeral. And a lot of times when you do funerals, you don't know the person very well, but I felt like I got to know Louise pretty well. We talked like pretty much every day and about a whole range of different topics, right? And I remember one of the things I said about Louise at the funeral was that everyone thought that Louise was holy, or everyone knew that Louise was holy, right? But she wasn't holy for the reasons that people might have thought, So oftentimes, again, people think about holiness in terms of, various habits of self-control and virtue and this mystical aura and stuff like that, right? But Louise was holy because she loved what God loved and she hated what God hated. And I love that about her, It was a side of her that people didn't typically see. So when I saw Louise, I remember so many times we were having these private conversations, and when something was not right, she'd be so upset, And not even, like, certainly in terms of, like, the world, but on a local level, that's the thing that was kind of brilliant, right? Because a lot of people can be upset by, like, the state of the world and politics or whatever. But for her, it was like, here's a situation locally, or here's this person in the context of this particular situation, and they could be great. And it saddens me that they don't realize how great they could be if only they this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, it was frustrating for her because she wanted it, in a certain sense, more than these people wanted it. It was a constant source of tension. On the other hand, whenever people did correspond to the grace of God and try their best, quite apart from individual failures, whenever people tried their best to go God's way and fail and fall and try again, like over and over again, and live in that space, like her heart soared. And she really rejoiced in that, I remember many times like talking about like wonderful people in the parish, like, hey, it's like such and such person with this and that. And of course she said her typical thing, like, oh yes. And she really had this authentic sense of joy about the thing, right? So really good example of that, right? I'll give you another example from the Bible, right? So I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's becoming a catchphrase now. But you ever seen that movie, Paul, the Apostle of Christ? Yeah, because we're all Catholic, right? So there's that moment where St. Paul is talking to St. Luke. And you remember Paul's in prison and Luke is visiting him in prison, right? And there's a whole thing where Luke is giving the report of like the state of the situation, right, with the early church. And people are being killed and persecuted, lit up like human candles, and there's abortion and whatever. It's rampant. And the young men in our community, they want to go and kill the Romans. And then Paul's like, oh, well, Luke, what did you say? I said, the only way is love. And Paul's like, you don't buy it, right? And he's like, no, I don't. Like, you don't understand what's happening. It's just terrible things that are happening, right? And up to this point, it's all about framing and blocking, like in a stage situation. So St. Paul, to this point, he's in this reclining position. He's just reclining on his bed in his prison situation. And then, Luke is like upright and he's like complaining about the state of the world and, whatever. It's just darkness and we have every reason to give into violence and despair. At this point, when he starts to kind of, poo-poo the thing about love, that's when Paul stands up and he assumes the position of a teacher. And he says, love is patient, love is kind, love is never boastful or arrogant or rude. And he goes on like this, right? Almost like I'm telling you now, this is the only way. And it's firm, and it's bold, right? So much different than what we typically hear. Oh, love is patient, love is kind, whatever. And what he's saying is that, look, your fundamental error is that you think that love is weak. But love is not weak, love is strong. And that's the only thing that will bring about the conversion of the world. And so it's a variation of I get it, things are difficult, but the only thing that will turn people to Christ are the weapons of the Spirit, not the weapons of the world. If you respond with anger and hatred and violence, it will only escalate the thing in a terrible sort of way. We're trying to turn people into other Christs in this world, and the way to do that is to persevere in a stance of suffering love. But you got to believe in it. You got to bet your whole life on it. Love is patient, love is kind, all those different things. You're buying something with your money, right? It's not being pathetic. This is what the Lord requires to bring about the salvation of the world, right? Now, another thing with that, in terms of the hungering and thirsting for righteousness, right? So we talked about not settling, but the other thing too, sort of a similar point made in parallel, to not have justice or a sense of righteousness based on falsehood, right? Now, this is going to tie a little bit to, remember what we're going to talk about in the future with regards to peace, being a peacemaker, but why not? We'll talk about it here, right? So many times, what we're looking for is the avoidance of conflict. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to stir the pot. And so it's under the guise of I just want things to be in right relationship with God. But it's the whole thing. I've come not to bring peace to the world, but a sword, right? And so sometimes you got to get in there, right? And again, fight with the weapons of the Spirit. So a lot of times what happens is people have a sense of equilibrium or balance or peace, again, based on a lie, right? You see this a lot with family, So, how many times we're in family and it's just I can't talk to this person. I can't risk bringing up this thing or saying this thing in the way that I want to say it because I don't think the relationship can handle it. And so I back away and we simply coexist. I don't think it is a betrayal of confidence, but just to say generally, one of the things you notice as a priest in pastoral practice is you hear both sides of the situation. And it's framed in the same way. Whether it's a husband or a wife or friends or whatever, or boyfriend, girlfriend, and it's there's all these things in my heart. And I want to have authenticity and sincerity and truth in our relationship, but I don't feel like the relationship can handle that. And so, again, we simply coexist. We simply have this sense of equilibrium and balance, right? And the other person says the exact same thing. And it's what? Why are you talking to me? You both want the same thing. You both want the same thing. Let me give you a reference point with regards to this, right? Because I think a lot of times the way we frame it in our minds is either I lash out and there's this huge argument that we can't recover from, or I stay silent and just bury my feelings, right? But to frame it in terms of vulnerability, I talk about that a lot, but there's a reason why, right? So to frame it in terms of vulnerability, so to use an analogy, it's when you go to a funeral. When you go to a funeral and someone's giving the words of remembrance or the eulogy, they can be an awful speaker, technically speaking. But as long as it's honest and true, it's compelling. It's completely compelling, partially because people aren't used to that, but also because people recognize vulnerability and they thirst for it because we're so used to having shallow and superficial relationships. And that's a long way of saying is that, look, when you approach someone with whom you've been in conflict for a period of time, and it's just look, I want to share with you something that's on my heart, with the corresponding invitation to be hey, look, I want you to share what's in your heart. And we're really going to seek a sense of understanding, even if it results in a place of okay, that's your position, that's my position, but at least we see each other's position. That's a really kind of good thing, right? But here, it kind of leads into the other point too, right? to realize it's meant to be an incremental thing. It's almost like collective bargaining, right? It's like you wonder sometimes, like, oh, how come the NHLPA and like the NHL owners can't resolve the thing in one go, right? How come they can't just say, here's my position, here's your position, let's just split it down the middle and call it a day? And part of the reason why is because you discover what it is that you really want through dialogue. And it's not because of a lack of goodwill, it's just like, that's just how it goes. Like, I thought this is the thing I really wanted, but then as I talk it out and I verbalize my interior experience, I realize I discover something about myself, even as I discover something about you, right? So I'll give you another example with regards to this whole falsehood thing, right? So you may have heard a story before, but there's this Catholic speaker who was auditioning for a High School Musical, and she did it in large part because she wanted to impress this young boy. So the story's going to end badly, right? So, and so she did this audition, and it blew up in her face. It was just awful. And she came out, and she ran into this boy that she was trying to impress, and he was like, "Boy, you really blew that one, didn't you?" Like, "Oh, not going to date you," right? But just think about that. And so, what happened is she looked at that particular episode in her adulthood. Like, she didn't realize at the time what a trauma that was, because we don't think of things in that way when we're young. We just think that was a horrible day. But actually, here's a trauma which impinges upon my essential sense of identity and governs my conduct going forward. So what she did, in retrospect, was that in that moment, when she was hurt badly by this person who should have loved her, that she could have loved in return, right? It was like, look, I will never be hurt like that ever again. I will never be hurt like that ever again. So I'll always be strong, I will always be performative, I will always be efficient and never weak. Because I will never let someone hurt me ever again in my vulnerability. Now, the thing with that, it's, the world always affirms you in that direction, right? The world loves it when you're a functionary, when you're merely efficient and productive and all these things, right? But again, it's based on a lie. It's based on a lie. And the whole thing about justice, right relationship with God, you gotta work to unpack those things in the world, but beginning also with yourself. Like, do I have certain structures or compulsions or habits or routines that are based on fears, things which are not true, things which are not grounded in my identity as a beloved child of God? Okay, a couple practical things with regards to this hungering and thirst for justice, right? So we talked about it not being a private affair, but I want to expound upon that a little bit. Ralph Martin, he talks about this, right? And he says, a lot of times people will say, "Who are you to impose your faith on me? You just believe your truth, I believe in my truth, and we'll call it a day," right? The way he phrases it is like, there's the world and the flesh and the devil. The world, the flesh, and the devil. And these three things are conspiring mightily all the time, full court press, to pull people away from the light into the darkness. So based on that, what do? I can't be neutral. And it's not imposing my view upon you. It's not like, you like soccer, I like football, but you gotta love football, right? It's like, no, you need this. I know you don't think so, but you actually do, right? So that's why my faith, that's why the thirst for justice can't be simply a private affair. That's why when we talk about, the Greek in terms of right relationship, it's not just me and the Lord, it's like the world. The other thing too, again, we touched upon this notion of trying not to reduce change to like the single knockout punch. And we do that as well, right? So, you think, okay, I'm going to avoid this. I'm going to avoid wrestling with this issue, or I'm going to avoid this potential for conflict, or this honest conversation, because I don't think the thing's going to go well. But sometimes what it is, it's setting the table for something else. I often say this with regards to parents. I mean, parents, you probably know this, but just to affirm you from the pulpit, right? Many times you can be in a situation where you're actually saying everything perfectly right, but your kids still don't seem to accept it, But you look back on it, especially when you examine your conduct at the end of the day, like, okay, did I do that right? Not simply did I say the right things, but did I say it the right way? Was the timing right? Did it fall on me as opposed to someone else to have that conversation? Now, if that's not the case, you got to own up to that, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of situations where, I played that thing exactly the way I should have played it. It just didn't seem to be affirmed in the moment, but it doesn't make it less right. So just to be aware of that as well, right? Another thing with regards to justice, right? It's an incarnational thing. It's an incarnational thing, right? So it's, You have to be mindful of people's soul, but also their body, right? So the way I like to frame it is not simply in terms of you got to give people social support and whatever, right? It's like you want to be real. Anything you can't reduce to the incarnation, there's something not Christian about that. Anything you can't reduce to like the incarnation, like of the earth, like here, tangible, like human stuff, there's something not Christian about that. And so what I mean by that, practically speaking, is that when you're journeying with people, which we're all called to do, right? It's easy to live on the level of empty platitudes. It's easy to live on the level of empty platitudes because I don't need to examine my heart. I can do it at arm's length. I can feel good because I'm the one who gives advice and this person receives my wisdom, But it's not really that helpful. I was talking to a really good friend of mine this morning. I was just like, going into the Lenten Mission, I thought, one thing I don't want to have happen is like people hear the Lenten Mission are like, yeah, I guess we got to be poor in spirit. It's the idea of recognizing that the gospel has something to say to everyone in the uniqueness and complexity of their experience, right? Another way of saying it is, you got to be real. But an important prerequisite to that is you need to have done that journey yourself. It's something that an older priest friend of mine would say all the time. In order to meet people in their uniqueness and complexity and their depth, you have to have done the first thing with yourself, right? We're just like, okay, what are my hopes, my dreams? How have I experienced loss and sadness and frustration? And have I brought God into that? And as I work through those things, those heartaches and disappointments and the highs and the lows, through that I gain a certain knowledge of God, how He works through those things. I gain a certain confidence, and the fruit of that I share with other people. And if you don't do that, and you do you practice the faith at arm's length, all you have to offer is empty platitudes, right? Whereas if you do the other thing, and you put in all the work in terms of meeting yourself to meet other people, people could have different experiences, but it's just like, no, I'm confident in being here in this moment with you because I've done the work. I've done the work. And not to say it's just a been there, done that type of thing, but it's obviously an ongoing thing. But we have to be right there in it. It has to be incarnational, and both of us have to be real. Final thing, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. It's an absolute promise. Like whenever you show mercy, any circumstance, no matter what the situation, regardless of who is the recipient of mercy, mercy is promised to you in return. And also it's a paradox, right? Blessed are those who give mercy, they will receive mercy in return. It's shades of that really famous prayer by St. Francis of Assisi, right? Seek not to be consoled, but to console. Seek not to be loved, but to love. So it's a sweet spot, right? It's a variation of John Paul II's law of the gift. How do I find life? By giving of myself to the point of sacrifice for the sake of God or the sake of other people. And it's one of those things you're like, yeah, I know that. It's like, yeah, no, you don't. You're still trying to build your life around like wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. And how you know that is like, okay, what happens when I'm going through life and I feel profoundly my sense of lack and my sense of interior poverty? Like, what do I do? You know what you do? You reach for the chips. Or some variation of the chips, So, like, what's that all about? Like, I feel this lack, and I don't... What I'm supposed to do is give at the very moment when I don't feel like it. That's the thing, right? To choose to love at the very moment where I don't feel like loving, because that's when you need it the most. Another way to phrase it is like, what's the thing that I really long for in my heart? I want connection, for example. I want authentic relationships. And try to be authentic in your relationships, I'm feeling sad. Who in my life is feeling sad? And maybe I go out and reach out to them, So it's a paradoxical thing. It's tapping into this thing. Those who give mercy will receive mercy in abundance, right? Now, just to be clear as well, right? So when we talk about mercy, again, it's one of those things. Like, what do you think about when you think about mercy? Sister Miriam James Heidland, she talked about this. You remember that game in elementary school where someone has their fingers interlocked with yours, right? And they're doing this. You're like, oh, mercy. But it kind of plays to this notion of like mercy, right? Like, oh, like God's giving me mercy. Like, oh, what do you do? That's great. It seems condescending and humiliating and all these different things. But I remember my spiritual director saying to me, I was going to say a long time ago, but during our last session, everything is mercy. The way he phrased it is like, Eric, eventually you'll realize that everything is mercy. Everything is God's mercy. Everything is God's mercy. Freely given, freely received, right? And that's a different notion of mercy. And you find that, for example, in the Latin translation, right? So misericordia, right? So cor and misery, right? So the idea is cor is heart, and then misery is like mystery. So the idea is that whenever I encounter misery in any circumstance involving any person, my heart is moved. And I engage in trying to be a conduit of God's grace to bring that situation a new life. Like, that's mercy, right? So conveyed in that is deep desire and deep love and this creativity. It's further expounded upon in the Hebrew translation, actually. So I can't pronounce it in the Hebrew, but basically the idea is the Hebrew rendering for mercy. It's that abdominal region which corresponds to the womb, which is kind of interesting, right? So what happens when I'm merciful? What happens when I'm merciful is that I feel something stirring in that place from which life is generated. And from that place, I seek to restore and heal and create and bring new life. Another way to put it is that the reason why God is merciful is because God is creator. And I find that's a really helpful working image, right? Because it's just like, okay, the world's your oyster, right? So there's like the world, generically speaking, and the people in it, but then there's like people within my circle of influence. Again, not in a condescending sort of way, but there's people I can touch and I can see and I can have a relationship with, right? And so with regards to the people in my life, I'm called to be merciful. It's not like, oh, you wronged me, I forgive you, and so I'm living up to that particular beatitude. It's like, no, I'm called to participate in the dynamic and powerful work of the Creator God. And shouldn't that be a super exciting thing? You know, I mentioned at the outset that I was priest chaplain of like those post-secondary schools in Oshawa. And something I would always tell to people who became campus minister in that particular setting was like, we can go through all sorts of complications in terms of what the job involves, but basically here's the deal, right? So we're here by mandate of the Archdiocese, and I'm the pastor, you're the campus minister, and we have money, and we have these students, and so the world's our oyster. So what do we do, right? And so we do programs, we can turn with people individually, but yeah, the only limit is your desire and your creativity. And the hope and the aspiration was hopefully that captures one's imagination, and then you can think, oh gosh, there's all sorts of things I can do to bring that person a new life, and that person, and so on and so forth, right? A couple examples just to flesh out that point, right? So a while ago I was talking about prophetic gestures, you know, so in terms of like some action you can do to bring someone a new life, right? And I think in that particular homily, when I look back on it, I think I gave the impression that the only efficacious or accurate prophetic gesture is one which shames another person into a stance of right behavior. But it's also good things too. Basically, the prophetic gesture is, what can I do to lead the person to the good? What can I do to help this person become the person that God's calling them to be? Through my action, through my powerful witness and action, quite apart from my words, even though they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So a couple examples of that. Les Miserables, everyone has seen that, right? So based on the musical, which is a term based in the book, right, by Victor Hugo. And there's a whole thing at the beginning where there's Jean Valjean, right? And he's been in prison for stealing the piece of bread for, I think, his sister or some girl, right? And he's caught. So the Russell Crowe character, he's the prison warden, I suppose, and he's always calling him by his number as opposed to his name. Like, this is who you are. You have lost your humanity because you stole a piece of bread. And he did. He did steal a piece of bread, right? And so this is what you are forever. And you can never escape from that. You can never graduate from that, right? So even when he's released from prison, he's trying to get work, he's trying to find shelter, but it's like he has to show this piece of paper. You're no longer a man, you're simply a number. It's a dehumanizing thing, right? So he's rejected, he's abused, and all these different things. And then what happens is he's taken in by this bishop. You know, so he's taken into the rectory and whatnot. And it's interesting that the housekeepers who work for the church, they look at him with disgust as he ravenously eats the chicken. Remember that? And then, but the bishop's looking at him, it's like, yeah, okay, like whatever, right? And then here's a bed, sleep there. But even in that moment, Jean Valjean doesn't trust it. Like I've been treated with violence and rejection and abuse, and so this he seems to be kind, but do I trust that or the multitude of experiences I've had which have been largely negative? And so obviously he trusts his pain, right? So what he does is he steals the silver and he runs away, but he's caught by the cops. And then the cops drag him like an animal to the bishop, like we caught this guy, right? And you remember what the bishop does? He's like, you forgot the 2 silver candlesticks, right? And so he gives it, and he's like, farewell, officers, job well done. And they leave, right? And so he's talking to this guy, and he's blown out of his everlasting mind, right? And the idea is that, look, it is true, you stole the piece of bread. Just like with us, right? So you don't have to say well, I committed a sin, but I didn't mean it. No, we all, not only do we have the capacity for evil, but we've chosen evil multiple times. You can be honest about that, right? But that kind of plays up the reality of God as a Savior, right? So we've all done some variation of I've stolen the piece of bread. I can't hide behind my lack of intention or whatever. I've done evil things, right? That is the case, right? And yet God is merciful, and yet God loves us all the same. And so go forth and live your life. And he becomes this amazing philanthropist, So it's a variation of go forth and love others as I've loved you. Be merciful to others as I've been merciful to you, right? I'll give you one more example. Another movie example. You ever seen that movie Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio? It's worth it just to see this one scene. You can look it up on YouTube, right? So basically there's this guy, and I guess it's set in Africa, I think. And so Leonardo DiCaprio, he's with this guy. His name's Solomon, I think. And he has a son who's been captured into to become a child soldier. And so he's been brainwashed and all these different things. And so the whole thing is Leonardo DiCaprio's character is looking for the diamond, but Solomon, he's looking for his son. And all of a sudden they find the son. And this is the peak of him being brainwashed. And the son has this gun, and he's pointing it at Leonardo DiCaprio's character. And so Leonardo DiCaprio kind of pauses and he kind of begs the father to intervene. And then he points the gun at his father. So it's a really kind of dramatic moment, right? So the son threatens to kill the father. And you sense that in a certain sense of despair. I've done so many bad things. I'm a child soldier. I've killed so many people, right? I am no good. And so I see my father who reminds me of my past life, but that memory is painful. And so it would seem easier to kill the past memory and just give into the darkness. And if you're honest, we've all been there before, right? So what he says, I'm not going to do it justice, right? So definitely look it up on YouTube later on. So he says, Dia, what are you doing? The gun points at him, right? And he just you can tell the father's right in there. Right? He doesn't back away, but he kind of leans into it, right? So he's like, look, I know you've done bad things. I know they made you do bad things, but you're not a bad boy, right? So you've done bad things, but this doesn't define you, right? You're not a bad boy. You're always a child of God. And that plays up in the very next line, which is beautiful, right? And so he leans in and he's like, I'm your father who loves you. And you will come home with me and be my son again, right? And that particular thing, I can never say it without being moved because it's it captures the gospel. That's why I'm so bullish about this point that it's not about prayer routines and schedules and this and that. God comes and loves us despite anything. That's why you don't need to be afraid in terms of bringing out the secrets of your past life. I did this, I used to be that, maybe I still am this. It doesn't matter. And the moment you grasp that, it's wow, this is amazing. God is amazing, and you would be right. You would be right. And the whole thing about Lent and Easter, if we come to the end of Lent and we just we feel bad and we just stay in that, or here comes Easter and Easter is simply the time where I stop doing my penitential practices, and thank God for that. That's not quite the gift that God wants to give to you. This whole thing with the season of Lent and Easter is okay, I revisit the frailty and poverty of who I am, and God comes to me and reminds me that He is my Father, and He calls me yet again to be His child. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.